So here we are, number 12, Warren Street. I call it the 911 No Planer Flop House. There's my bike over there. And I've got a piece of, a very giant piece of apple pie in here, made by moi, and I'm going to give it to Dominic. So let's see what happens. On the second floor, we have something very interesting. We discovered Jesus in the Quran. This is a masjid. That's like a Muslim church. This is where they pray. Someone's in there praying, so I won't disturb him. Hello? I heard there's an art opening. Is there an art opening here?
An art opening? Wow, what a great start.
Hey, Dominic. I have some apple pie for you.
Hey.
Yeah.
Oh, you're here to take pictures of me. I'm the man, baby. That's what chicks do. They just come to photograph me.
That's true. Do you like apple pie?
It's the
Want
only
to eat some now? It's a recipe from my mom, and she got it from her mom.
It's funny, you entered my psyche recently because you had come to look at the Duffy's creation of my computer world into some artwork. And I wanted to speak with you about something, but we don't have to talk about that right now.
You don't want to do it now?
Well, I still don't want to do that on camera. That's a different subject that could be more entertaining on camera. Would you like to
Yeah, be entertaining on camera.
entertaining? Or perhaps I'll pull up my pants. And,
You don't have to do that.
right?
I mean, you could
People
do
are more
that.
entertaining lately when they take off their pants, apparently. The internet is any judge.
Do you spend much time on the internet?
I was an internet engineer. I was there at the beginning.
You're kidding. I didn't know that about you.
I was there at the beginning. That's how what do you say? I'm an eccentric who gets all the computers, detritus of the world, but no, that's not the case. So I don't know what to do.
I remember.
Hey, we're in the big city, and everything's expensive, and they're throwing us out because they can.
So Duffy's art exhibition is not here.
Yeah, it is. It's in the basement. Is that why you're here, to photograph that?
Yeah. Hi, this is Paula Glory, and this show is called Farther Down the Rabbit Hole. Today I have the great good fortune to have with me on the telephone Professor Robert Ashford, and he's going to talk to us today about binary economics. At the same time, we're streaming live at rabbitholecentral.tv. This is what I call a bonus stream. Typically, I'm only streaming for sure Monday through Friday at 12 noon. But today, because, Professor Ashford is a busy professor at the law school, it was easier for him to book some time with us on a weekend. So in the future, stay posted for this type of event, because I hope as I start to get more comments from YouTube, because that's the nature of the internet and the interactivity, we can start to develop this in a way that isn't developed in academic institutions. So for all of those bright people out there who, for various reasons, didn't get the education they feel that they had the capacity to have, well, lo and behold, here's your chance. So thank you so much, Robert, for joining us.
I'm delighted to be here. Anything I can do to help people understand this subject would be just a distinct pleasure for me.
Wonderful. So what I first want to say is that I went to the website that you suggested, and I got the downloads that are free. And I want to tell the people out there that you can go to SS, which is Social Service Resource Network.
It's social science.
Oh, Social Science, sorry.
Research Network.
Research.
So it's at Sam, Roger, Now for the acronym.
Okay.
SSRN.com.
Great. And then you can download these papers. And the ones that I got here is Binary Economics, about the theory that gave rise to the ESOPs. And you're going to tell us today, I hope, about how we can have the super ESOP. And then also we'll go into what exactly binary is. You have 3 points here. 1, labor and capital are equally fundamental, independent, or binary factors of or inputs to production. 2, technology makes capital much more productive than labor. And 3, capital has a strong, positive, distributive relationship to growth, such that the more broadly capital is acquired, the more it can be profitably employed to increase output, which is the principle of the binary growth. So, thank you, and take it away.
Well, I'll do what I can. First of all, if the listeners, the viewers, do go to ssrn.com, the next thing you'll need to do is to type in my name, Robert Ashford, in the author search.
Okay.
You'll get 5 potential articles. For people who are beginning on this, I would suggest that the first article, Binary Economics, the theory that gave rise to ESOPs, and then the second one, Overview of Binary Economics, those are the essential 2 articles. If you read those and struggle with them, the second one is a little harder than the first. You really do have all you need. And I have to apologize that I've not been able to make it clearer to people who are not schooled in economics, but that's part of the mission of my life. So you go there and do that, and if you have trouble downloading, there's a help number. It's a toll-free number on the website, on the SSRN website, and I find those people just wonderful. They answer right away. You don't get a long telephone queue. They can help you. I think the only thing you have to do is you have to register, meaning to say you have to give them your email address. But other than that, it's a free service, and so that's the reference point.
Okay, great. So we'll have people go to ssrn.com. So good.
And then download it. But I can try to explain a little bit about binary economics if we can sort of start on that, and then if you feel that I'm either jumping ahead too far or saying things that need to be explained, Paula, then you just interrupt me and
okay.
We'll do it from
That's
there.
a
But
deal.
I guess I'll just sort of free-associate
That's a
a little
deal.
bit and see if I can put enough on the table
Great.
to explain it. A part of what I will be doing is also explaining what binary economics isn't. Now that may sound funny. Why do you have to explain what it isn't? But what I've learned over the years is that we have so many preconceptions about economics and about economic policy and about economic justice, so many preconceptions, that sometimes it's important to explain what something isn't before you explain what it is. And I always use an example from astronomy that sort of gives you the idea of the kind of change you have to get this idea. And it's really ultimately a very simple idea. in places, and it's as true in China as it is in the USA, everywhere, Africa, everywhere. But it's a complete illusion. The sun doesn't rise and the sun doesn't set. The truth is that the Earth is spinning.
Right.
But from our perspective, it looks like the sun rises and the sun sets. But that notion of the truth, that is to say that the Earth is spinning, laid the foundation for all of modern physics with Isaac Newton, and the foundation that laid really the foundation for the scientific world. It's the same kind of change in understanding economic theory and economic justice that comes with binary economics. It's a simple idea that gets complicated the more you try to explain to people who won't surrender that basic misconception. So
Right.
that's just a little bit of precursor. That is
Okay.
to say, if you've ever seen the drawing of two faces, profiles, looking at each other, and suddenly you can see that there's a vase in the middle, it takes a little bit of a leap.
Right.
So that's a way of beginning to understand it, and I have to then move into it more clearly. Another thing I'm going to say, which is just in a sense foundational before, is that the binary economist is looking at something that a lot of people don't focus on, and that is the notion of unutilized productive capacity. That is, a capacity to produce that we don't use. And I would say in a capitalist system, we don't use it primarily because people don't think it's profitable to use it. That is to say, we make as many things as it's profitable to sell, and we don't make any more. But technologically, we have the capacity to produce. I probably don't have to convince your leaders, your viewers, that in a technological sense, we could come closer to feeding and clothing and sheltering the world today and giving people the resources to develop themselves to their highest good, far closer today than 200 or 300 years ago. So there is this capacity, and we don't use it. And the question becomes why we don't use it, and what we can do to begin employing that capacity, not simply as a matter of charity, but as a matter of profit, in the sense that everybody will profit from the greater use of our resources. So the binary economist is looking at this problem of unutilized productive capacity. Now, and we have these three principles that binary economics holds to, and it's now I'm going to begin to explain a little bit about what the binary and binary economics is.
Right.
The binary economist divides all of the production of goods and services into two broad categories. One is the human. Humans do work, and some of them work very, very hard, and some of them work very, very hard for very, very little. But clearly, humans are involved in the productive process, growing food, gathering food, catching game. There's obviously all the different things involved in growing food. They make clothing, they make shelter. Humans have been doing that for a long time. So the human factor is one, and then there's the non-human factor, and that is everything that is not human, but goes into the production of goods and services. So it's the human and the non-human. That's what's binary. Binary is a fancy word for saying composed of two. So the binary economist starts with the notion that both capital and labor are involved in production. Now, that's not a very radical concept, because if you study economics, you'll know that that many approaches divide it into these factors. Some have additional factors, and some separate land from the manufactured capital. So there's three factors. Some talk about human capital, so there's a fourth factor, and some talk about financial capital, so there's a fifth factor. But the binary economist says the most important thing to understand is the distinction between that which is human and that which is non-human. So we start with that. The second thing we argue that we made an important mistake starting from Adam Smith, and it really spills all the way over into the present. In a funny way, although economics understands that capital is important to economic growth and to prosperity, Adam Smith thought of the reduction of labor. In almost all of Smith's analysis, you see this to be the case. So an example might be you saw 10 boards an hour with a hand saw and 100 boards an hour with a machine saw. The machine saw makes the person 10 times as productive. Or you dig a hole in 4 hours with a little small shovel, and with a steam shovel you can dig a hole 10 times the size in just a few minutes. So machines make humans more productive, and that's the relationship. The binary economist says that really the machine is an independent worker, and so our example of industrial growth of growth is to haul a sack a mile and you're exhausted. You put 10 sacks on a horse and go twice as far in half the time. The horse has done something very important beyond making the person more productive. The horse is really doing almost all the extra work. And if we had a legal system that gave horses a property right in their own work, the horse would never, and the attorney for the horse would never concede that the only thing the horse has done is make the person more productive. And then you see the same thing if you put 1,000 sacks on a truck and you do 50,000 sack miles worth of work. And the time that the driver just gets out and goes to a dance, and that's hardly exhausted at all. We would say the truck does most of the work. So
right.
The binary economist sees that capital and labor are independently productive. Not in the sense that it may not take a person to drive the truck or lead the horse. But we look at each task. Some people say, well, the horse wouldn't go anywhere without the person, so the person's essential. Well, when we say, all right, but the work of leading is not the work of hauling. Those are different kinds of work. So that if instead of leading a horse, I were to lead 10 people, each of whom is hauling a sack on his or her back, why would we deny the work of the independent haulers just because I'm doing the leading? So you have to look at each individual task involved. So once you focus on the idea that capital is in a way an independent producer, and then you try to understand the great growth in our economy from 1700 to 1800 to 1900 to 2000, and there has been huge growth. There's been a huge output increase. Not so much that labor is doing more of the work, it's really that capital is doing more and more and more of the work. Capital does its own work, and it not only replaces labor, but it does far more work than labor. So if you begin focusing on this reality, this different way of looking at things, the earth spinning rather than the sun rising, the idea that capital does its own work, then the binary economist says actually capital does 6 wonderful things. 4 of them are very much involved in production in the real world. Capital replaces labor. So the horse hauls, the human hauls, and so the horses we replace labor work with capital work. That's a major part of the Industrial Revolution. It's a major part of what distinguishes us from most animals. Most other animals, we are able to shift the production from the human to the non-human. The second thing is that not only does capital work in the same way that labor works, it hauls, it calculates, it does, it pushes, it pulls, it lifts, it does all these different things. But usually it does it for many things, it does it much more. That is to say, we can't compete with horses for hauling or trucks. We can't compete with computers for calculating. There's so many things. The idea of capital substituting for labor, it not only substitutes for labor, it does thousands of times more work than labor does. And that's wonderful that it does that. That's the second thing that capital does. It vastly supplements the work of labor. The third thing capital does is that, and this is something that people don't fully always understand, is that capital does work that labor can never do. I love to tell people that a farmer never grew an apple.
Right.
All a farmer can do is help a tree grow an apple. They may be able to help a tree grow an apple better by fertilizing and tending to it. But the work of fertilizing and tending is not the work of growing apples. It's the apple tree that grows the apples.
So along that line,
Sure.
do you think that the Industrial Revolution, the cruelty of it, could have been avoided, all the sweatshops and things, if people kind of got with it? Because the things you're talking about, I think people think of because of the intellectual property laws, and that this is all a function of the new technology with computers, and that ideas are so valuable. Do you think, I remember once you said that intellectual property is not any different than what it's always been.
Intellectual property is not any different. All of these things, all of these understandings that we have, an understanding in and of itself doesn't do work. The idea of putting a sack on a horse doesn't do work. The idea of what it takes to build a truck doesn't in and of itself do work. But when we create the physical things, and the physical thing can be a computer program, can be an idea, can be a process, can be like Henry Ford, an assembly line. When you get the idea and you give it what you might call physical instantiation, that is to say physical existence, then that thing that physically exists does work. And it doesn't have to be a tangible thing. It can be a process. It can be how tangible is a computer program? But a computer program can do an awful lot of work.
So where's the capital there, and who would own it?
Well, that's the question. And all I'm doing right now is trying to give people an idea that capital is terribly, wonderfully productive. And then the question of ownership becomes crucial.
Right.
And if you just let me give two more.
Sure.
One more proposition on what capital can do, and we'll talk about the ownership process.
Okay.
Because that is the other issue here.
Okay.
But the only other thing I want to say about capital is that not only does capital do work that labor can never do. For example, we cannot pound a single nail into a board without a hammer. There was no, the work didn't exist. You can't. There's so many things that we can't do without capital. We can't make a single computer chip. We can marvel about the computer revolution, but our hands are too big. So when people say, capital makes more work for labor, fine, but capital makes much more work for capital. So we have four things. We'll talk about the other two later when we talk about ownership. But we have four things.
But excuse me, Robert, just to stay up with you, you were saying that Adam Smith was saying that capital makes labor more productive. In the case of a hammer, he's right, correct?
Well, I would say that capital makes capital much more productive than labor. It makes labor more productive in the sense that without the capital, a person could not be productive in pounding nails.
Right.
But I would say that the person couldn't be productive at all without the work of the hammer. Couldn't be productive at all. So although remember the first proposition is that capital and labor each do work.
Right.
The second proposition is technology makes capital much more productive than labor. So let's take the hammer example. Before the invention of the hammer, nobody could drive a nail.
Right.
But the invention of the hammer, which of course started probably as a simple stone, that's the idea of picking up. Now, the idea of picking up a stone and using it to pound the sharp thing into some wood or something to put the two things together, that's an idea. The idea doesn't do work. Somebody has to take the stone and do that. But stone is round. It's better to have a flat surface. It's better to have a long handle. Now we get invention. So we get better. So yes, it makes the person more productive in doing the hammering. But it's the capital instrument. The stone is not as productive as the hammer. And then how about the automatic hammer, which is boards are coming through. They're running through an assembly line. Automatic hammers are pounding thousands of nails, and all somebody's doing is standing there watching the machinery and make sure it doesn't screw up.
So who benefits from that?
Maybe I have to, for your readers, then leap ahead, but you can't leap ahead until you begin to see that capital does its own work, and that although technology may make labor more productive in the sense that once you couldn't hammer nails, and then you can do it better with a hammer than a stone, but capital is also becoming more and more productive. So if you just pause, and then I'm going to get to ownership, just from movies, you have to recognize that the difference is capital. And now, once you recognize that the difference is capital and not labor, then you say, well, how can we distribute the ability to buy what is produced in a society in which most of the work, a great deal of the work, a huge amount of the work, has been shifted from the labor worker to the capital worker. Now, we're trying to solve the income distribution problem through wages and welfare. But capital is doing so much more of the work. The binary economist says, wait a minute, the only way you can distribute earning power directly is by ownership. The rules of ownership are that the person that owns the capital gets the income. So not only does capital do far more work than labor does, it has the capacity to distribute much more income than labor does. And it's that capacity to distribute income that makes you go back to the first question that I asked, and that is to say, why do we have unutilized productive capacity? And it makes you see that actually capital has two more powers. Beyond replacing labor, beyond vastly supplementing labor, beyond doing work that labor can never do, and the other one I didn't mention, the capital does work without labor. I mean, try living without your washing machine if you don't think machines do work. Those things are wonderful, but then capital can do two more things. Now we get to help people understand the rules of business, not in a way that keeps them out and excludes them, but in a way that includes them, brings them into the process. Capital can buy itself on the promise of its future income. Capital can, the rule of business is to only invest in things that pay for themselves, that generate by the work that they do and can do, that generate the income necessary to actually pay for themselves. Well, you can buy a capital instrument by work that you've already done in the past, whether through your labor or through your capital, or you can buy a capital instrument by the promise of its future income. Almost all people who own already take advantage of credit to acquire capital with its future earnings. And once you recognize not only is capital doing increasingly more and more of the work, but it can buy itself, whether for the poor or for the rich, whether for those that have a little and those that have a lot, that it's physically possible and economically possible to extend the power of capital to buy itself, not only for the rich people, but for the poor and working people.
Well, I think this is so astonishing, what you're saying. It's like the keys to the kingdom.
It is the keys to the kingdom. It's the secret that right now is camouflaged as long as you think that the only role of capital is to make labor more productive. And that takes us to the sixth point, and this is the one that I want to go through slowly because it is what is truly the earth spinning notion. The idea, no, the sun doesn't rise. In a way, it's just like the idea that the horse does its own work, and the truck and the hammer. But it's the other part of it that really is pay dirt. And here's what it is. Remember, we said that we seem to have great unutilized productive capacity. Now, I think we do. Now, some people don't, but I think we have huge unused productive capacity.
Well, I think my viewers and I think that we have enormous power because my show studies the destruction of the World Trade Center. There's enormous power involved with that.
Imagine if you were the queen of the world today. And by the way, if you were the queen of the world, I know you're not looking for that job. You're a Democrat, so you want to be in small D Democrat. You want democracy.
You know, there's never a free lunch. You know.
Well, but if you were the queen of the world today, and you wanted to feed and clothe and shelter the world, the viewers can ask themselves this: each
Right.
and every one of your viewers had the power to ordain any system,
Right.
you know, the unchallenged king or queen, and you wanted to be a good queen or a good king. Would it be easier to feed and clothe and shelter the world today than 100 or 200 years ago? Not everybody agrees, but most people think about that and they say, ago, it took 70% of the people to grow the food for us. Now it takes 3% of the people to grow the food. Almost everything involved in a basic economy: food, clothing, shelter, healthcare. It takes fewer people today than it did before, and it's because it's so. And then if I say, well, you're still the king or queen of the world today, but now you have a perverse desire. You remember the way the pharaohs loved pyramids? You just sort of love unutilized productive capacity. You want more of it. You go to Flint, Michigan, and you see a plant in mothballs because the jobs are in Korea.
Right.
And you say,
Right.
not enough. I want 5 plants in Flint, Michigan. Each one state of the art. Each one with my name on it. Maybe we'll shape them like pyramids, and they'll all be in mothballs because I love unutilized productive capacity. Well, it seems to me we could build more unused capacity today. So we have this huge capacity. And why? Why do we have it? The binary answer is very simple, and it's the answer that doesn't seem to ever emerge, and that is we have unutilized productive capacity because we have concentrated ownership. The statistics show that 1% of the people in our society own about 50% of the capital. And again, we're talking about land, machines, tools, structures, patents, trademarks, all the things that are embodied in America's 2,000 or 3,000 largest companies.
Oh, just a second, Robert. Stay tuned for part 2. This has been one episode of Farther Down the Rabbit Hole with Robert Ashford. So, Robert, we'll go in on part 2 to more of those points, okay?
Surely.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to pause it right. Hi, this is Paula Gloria, and this show is called Farther Down the Rabbit Hole. I'm streaming on March 2nd from rabbitholecentral.tv, and I have Robert Ashford with us to explain the whole points of binary economics. So thank you, Robert. Can you continue on? I'm sorry I wasn't able to get that all in.
Where we are now is looking at how can we solve this problem of unused capacity so we can profitably employ our capacity to feed, clothe, shelter more and more people, and eventually get everybody involved in the great promise of technology and the Industrial Revolution that seems to be denied right now. And I include, by the way, not only growth in the ugly brown sense of the term, but I include green growth. I mean a growth that is consistent with blue waters and clear skies and all of it, because a great deal of the environmental problems could be solved if people could afford greener technologies that we don't have right now. So what binary economics looks to, with the idea that capital is doing most of the work and that capital can buy itself, it looks to the idea that the promise of broader capital ownership in the future will provide the incentives to employ unused capacity in the present. That's the simplest explanation of what is so remarkably new about the binary approach. Not only does capital do more work, but it has the capacity to distribute more income. Now, business, it depends upon investing today in a capital instrument because it doesn't produce instantaneously. You invest today in a capital instrument or in the labor to create it in order for it to be productive in the future. That is to say, the demand for investment in the present or the employment of unused capacity in the present is because you think there will be more demand in the future. And the more broadly capital is acquired in the future, the more you will have demand to employ capacity in the present. So this thinking leads binary economists to a focus on a right. Now let's just talk about rights for a minute. I'm going to talk about rights here. We talk about, well, the right to a job, or there might be the right to labor, or the right to a clean environment, or the right to education, or the right to health care. Those are all very important rights. But let me give your viewers a right that is almost never talked about, but it's just sort of there in the air, just never talked about. It's the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. Not with the earnings of labor, but with the earnings of capital. So So in our example of the idea that you can haul a sack on your back, or you can haul a sack with a horse, and you can be paid either way, how much better it is to be able to haul a sack with a horse than to haul a sack on your back without the horse. And either one does work. So, and hauling a sack on your back is work of labor. Hauling your sack with a horse is work through ownership. So the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital is something that the rich have right now, but the poor do not have. But one can create the same circumstances that allow the rich to acquire capital with the earnings of capital and extend that to poor and working people as well. Now, before I try to explain how that can be done, let me just give you one other background note. Although most people have never heard of the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital, the Cold War was all about that right. There were the Western economies that were protecting the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital, and there were the communist economies intending to extinguish the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. The essence of a communist system is that nobody has the right to acquire substantial wealth-producing property with the earnings of capital. It's something that the state monopolizes. So here's an important right that the rich are willing to go to nuclear war to defend, but poor and working people don't understand it. And they think, most people think, well, the only people who can acquire capital with the earnings of capital are the rich, and that's just the way things are. It's just like, the sun rises. That's just the way things are. But the binary economist exposes the fallacy, because the truth is, as long as you have unutilized productive capacity, the capital that now buys itself for the rich can buy itself even more profitably as more and more people are included in the process. Because the promise of broader acquisition of capital with the earnings of capital at the future, that is from now to a future point, will more profitably employ our existing capacity and more profitably lead us to green, environmentally friendly growth and broader participation by everybody. That's the key to understanding the binary approach.
Can you explain to me how the binary approach will lead to greener solutions than right now?
Well, I certainly can. I'll do my best, and I want to say that what I'm suggesting right now is my view, my opinion, and not everybody, of course, will see it that way. But
that's fine.
Environmental issues as separable into two basic types of environmental problems. One type of environmental problem is a problem for which there is no technological fix. There's nothing we can do to solve this problem. We simply have to either prohibit people from doing it or tax people so that they're discouraged from doing it, or require them to pay for the environmental mess that they're creating. I mean, those are regulatory alternatives, and those have to be employed if you want to stop that environmental degradation. And that's just a regulatory solution. We can argue about whether it's necessary or not, but that's that. But I think that there's a whole other category of environmental problems for which there is a technological solution, but it's not employed because people cannot afford it. Right now, I guess we talk about hydrogen power and various kinds, but all these things are way out of what people can afford right now. But or we talk about the issues of countries selling their rainforest. Why? Because their people are starving and they've got to sell their rainforest in order to survive. But as people become more affluent because they are acquiring productive capacity not only by their sweat and their labor, but by the earnings of capital, as people become more prosperous, they will be able to afford more profitable, more costly solutions to the problems. So in one sense, many environmental problems are simply other examples of unused capacity. We have the capacity to have greener growth, but people cannot afford it. And then there's the choice that people have. It's either my job or this industrial industry that's a polluter. Well, it's fine to talk about not polluting, but I need a job to support my family. Well, as people become more capital rich, those kinds of forced choices are going to be replaced with win-win choices.
I see what you mean. You're talking about people making choices out of desperation that won't be there once you have capital more widely distributed.
That's right. People will be able to afford more. Another example of that, you're probably too young to remember this, but in the 50s there was a big scandal that you hear talked about, and it's called planned obsolescence.
Oh, I remember that. I'm not too old.
But so a company makes shoes that last only 2 years, because although they can make shoes that last 5 years, well, they really can't do that and still be able to sell, because if you've got a small consumer base that is limited to people who are either rich or people who have jobs and welfare, but then so many people don't have enough to afford, then you've got to sell more and more to the same people. I understand that there are brands of nylons and pantyhose that will last forever, but they don't dare make them. I don't know if that's true, but I hear that. Oh,
yeah.
But let me just suggest that if you've got an expanding consumer base, because capital is being acquired with the earnings of capital for more and more people, so that let's say in a period of 10 years, you've got twice as many people who can afford shoes, then you can make shoes that'll last longer. That is to say, you reduce the need for planned obsolescence as the consuming population gets bigger. I'm taken by something right now. I'm not a huge television watcher, but I have these tube televisions. I understand right now that you can get a flat screen television that costs 10 times as much and use 5 times as much energy. And increasingly, you go into the stores and you can't buy a tube television. Now, I must say I do not need a flat screen television. Of course, we're spending tons of money advertising to convince people they absolutely must have a flat screen television set.
Right.
And then, of course, with their other brain, they're worrying about the environment, but they're not being told that then. And so we're selling more and more TV sets to a fixed group of people. How about enabling people to acquire capital with the earnings of capital and sell more tube televisions to people who ever before couldn't afford it? Now, a flat screen television costs $500, and we got to have it. And, all this idea we got to have is all a process of needing to market our increasing productive capacity to a relatively small consumer population. We have an entirely different buying pattern and production pattern if we focused on the basics and created the sense in which let's create more and more consumers, enabling more and more people to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. Many things today that we keep on making, we don't need. Every time I turn on my computer, it says, update your screen now with a new thing. I don't want to update. It's good enough. It's good enough. You know what I'm saying? So I think we create this vast need to buy more and more and more and more. Why? Because we don't have consumers who can afford the basics that right now are lacking. And I think all of that will be reduced as capital is more broadly acquired.
No, I agree with all those models, but I think there's even more models because you're talking about kind of that hungry nature of capitalism that's always needing more markets and more resources.
But it's a plutocratic capitalism.
Exactly.
Not a capitalism that is grounded in what I would call reality.
Well, what I love about the binary approach is it's not making private ownership the culprit and the villain. It's just saying you need to distribute private ownership so that people have that kind of sense of concern and responsibility, maybe like you take care of a child.
Well, I think one of the beautiful things about binary economics is it recognizes that the real productive capacity is not in the human, but it's in everything around us. It actually breeds much more respect for the environment, for the animals, for the land, for the molecules outside of us, the technologies.
Right.
It's not so homomorphic and homocentric in that way. It opens up the understanding, and it's much more honest too. I sometimes flippantly say that conventional economics amounts to loading sacks on a horse and pretending you're doing the work.
Right.
It is. So I think that there's a great potential and for that, and there's much potential for greater respect and honesty in the binary approach.
Maybe, though, you've got a lot of people at the top of the heap right now that are just freaking out at the idea of any kind of change instead of seeing the brighter side of it, which is that as a result of including more, their whole experience, including their love of the power, will only increase when they have power with as opposed to power over.
Well, one would hope so. I don't know that we can change people. I think if you look at the people who are rich, I think that they divide into two groups. If you want to talk about, this is now just a little discourse in political reformation. My experience is that the rich have divided themselves into two groups. One group, and it's a very good group, it says that capitalism is wonderful, and if you can open that up to everybody, then that's just even better, because there'll be more respect for private property, there'll be less need for taxation, there'll be more participation, more respect, less need for security, less need for keys. That's wonderful. But then there's another group on the rich that say capitalism is wonderful because there's so few of us, and we don't want more. And that's an exclusionary group. I don't know how many are in one camp or the other, but I know that it's because the generous group in that population doesn't know about binary economics. If they simply knew about it, they would be more open to it. And I think the left wing has its two groups also. One group on the left, and this is a group that I think, like the rich that want to keep it all for themselves, have worked to exclude the binary theory from the discussion. They're the group that believes that the surplus of capital and labor should be distributed through wages and welfare, that's a virtue.
Right,
If you're
right,
not in
right.
favor of distributing the surplus of capital through wages and welfare, you're just stingy or spiritually unenlightened or
Right,
whatever, morally defunct. But then there's another group that says, well, I do have some problems with redistribution. I mean, take someone who's productive and have that person taxed for the benefit of somebody who's not productive. I see that as a problem, and I know that these conventional arguments that say when you reduce the incentives for productive activity, you're going to create a smaller pie. But there's no other way, they say.
Right.
But there is another way. There's the binary way. The binary way says if you enable everybody to acquire capital with the earnings of capital, you're going to get even more growth.
Right.
Because capital investment and labor investment today requires the promise of broader ownership in the future, and that can only be achieved by broader capital acquisition with the earnings of capital. We cannot distribute earning power through wages and welfare alone.
That's right.
As long as we're continually shifting the productive power from the labor, from the human to the non-human. So where I say Marx was wrong was not in his goals, but I think he's wrong when he thought of private property as theft. To me, private property is the only way people are liberated. You show me a materially liberated person, and I'll show you somebody who's earning not only from his or her labor, but from capital as well. The wonderful thing about capital is that it works when we sleep.
Right.
And everybody needs them.
Yes.
Not just the rich. Everybody needs them.
Yes, it's exactly like my YouTube account. When I'm sleeping, I can wake up and I have 2,000 more hits. That means because of this technology, because of this capital, I can get my message out even as I'm sleeping, which is amazing. Now, two things I want to bring up in our time that's left that you haven't considered yet, and I'm sure it's just like custom made for the binary model. This issue of copyright. I've spoken to a man who has been studying very diligently the whole developments in the zero-point energy, or getting energy from the vacuum. And it appears that it's right at our fingertips. But these scientists do not get peer-reviewed, nor do the entrepreneurial types want to become involved, because they feel even if you can get a patent on one way to do this, somebody else, once it starts to be happening, there'll be other ways to accomplish the same thing. You know, the idea will be out, the floodgates will open, and it's something that is of such enormous power that who owns it becomes very problematic. Now, it seems in a binary model where you are from the get-go distributing ownership, you're also going to tackle this very problematic area of copyright. And as you know, I've really been grumbling and complaining to anybody who I suspect can help. YouTube is taking down sites capriciously, and it becomes very problematic. Who owns YouTube? And then there's these areas, like I know with my friend Joe Friendly, he wants to regulate more. And I think regulation is not the way to go. He goes, people oriented in favor of the public and the planet at the center of the corporate decision-making process. And he goes on in his plan to say, therefore, this revolutionary stand, we the people need to change the legal framework of our nation so that we can take over ownership of the giant public corporations. And I think you've probably, and with the participation of the employees, choose new directors truly committed to serving the public and doing right by the employees and the planet. We need public discussion. Now, I'm sure throughout your years of being a professor, you have heard this, that we need new leadership and we need to take over the corporations. How is the binary model that you're proposing different from this?
Well, the binary model that I'm proposing is really what I would call the explication of something in the nature of a natural law.
Uh-huh.
And it doesn't require anything other than simply understanding to implement it. When I say that capital is independently productive, that technology makes capital more productive than labor, and that the more broadly capital is acquired, the larger the economy will grow, the more we'll employ unused capacity. That's just a principle. It's not a political agenda for taking over anything. And I, as a teacher, am not advocating any particular political agenda. I'm just trying to advocate what it is that people understand. These principles can be established whether or not you believe that corporations need to be taken over by the employees.
Well, I'm just thinking what you're doing when you're taking over, you're just sort of rearranging furniture, whereas I feel the binary model is more radical.
Well,
in a good way.
It's just more fundamental. You could be the king of England and want to own everything, or you could be Karl Marx and want to have the state own everything, and yet still begrudgingly admit that the more broadly capital is acquired, the bigger the economy will grow. It's a principle of it's a natural law. I mean, you can hate or love the law of gravity, but it's just there. So but I do believe that if one believes that power needs to be diffused rather than concentrated,
right.
If you believe that, then I think understanding that capital is independently productive, that technology makes it more and more productive, and that it can buy itself for the many as well as for the few, that principle is harmonious with people who want to diffuse power. But it doesn't happen overnight. I mean, the debate right now is, in a sense, the debate right now is that we've got these apple trees that are owned by a few people. And the question is, should the state own the apple trees, or should the apple trees continue to be owned by the few people, or should we tax the apple owners with by taking some of their apples and giving them to the poor? Or, as Joe's model is, or should we have the people take over the apple trees?
Right.
But binary economics economics just says more and more people can acquire apple trees.
So
You can't put an apple seed in the ground and demand it produce fruit overnight. The binary principles work in the very natural way. You build capital, it pays for itself, then it begins earning an income that distributes.
Okay.
It is an alternative.
Now you talk about the right to own capital, like you said, if you were the attorney for the horse. Do you see the first step, as I do, that you first have to inform people that this even
to
exists?
Me, the first thing is to have people understand these principles, to understand that capital is independently productive, that it can acquire itself, that technology makes capital ever more productive, that you can't distribute earning power through jobs and welfare when capital is on a market system, when capital is doing more and more of the work, and that the more broadly capital is acquired, the more the economy will grow. These are principles that exist whether you think the world should be run by a monarch or a despot or by a collective, or by a church, or it doesn't. I mean, however you think the world may be run is one thing, but these are principles that exist independent of that. They're independent of whether you think people are too greedy or too lazy or too this or too that. It's entirely independent. It's capital that's doing more and more of the work. It can buy itself for the few or the many. It's simply a question of understanding. Now, we haven't talked about the techniques. We probably need another show, but there are principles. Everybody's heard it takes money to make money.
Right.
Binary economics will explain why it is that almost all capital is acquired with the earnings of capital, and why capital tends to be concentrated, and why we have growing inequality. It explains that by helping us to understand more and more about the world of business, and we're just barely touching the surface.
I know we are. Can we meet next?
How to do it part we haven't covered.
Can we?
Principles are there.
Can we do it next Sunday?
Absolutely.
Okay, because I can put this out and then start to get some feedback and plow the ground, because this is such an enormously important topic. Before we end this show, I do want to clear up one thing that was called to my attention by one viewer.
Yes.
This does not mean that we all become lazy because we don't have to work anymore. I think, to me, what it means is that you wake up in the morning with the confidence that you're secure and you're taken care of, and that whatever work you do it out of freedom of choice, and you do it joyfully, like if you're changing your baby's diapers, or, obviously those are things that machines aren't going to be doing, but you do it out of joy.
Well, you were right, and let me emphasize that your viewer was very sharp to make the point. Let me just emphasize that binary economics is a gradual process. One of the reasons I don't know that radical is the best word for it. It's a you plant this apple seed in the ground, and it slowly becomes a tree, and after it matures, it produces apples. Think of it this way. Think of capital buying itself over a period of time. So let's say that it takes, if you take all the capital that we'd like to cut in the poor and working people, let's say that it may pay for itself in 5 years. So in the 6th year, after this aggregate capital, all the different machines and tools and everything over, is now 1 year's worth of capital has paid for itself. So maybe poor and working people begin to earn maybe 1% of their income from capital. And then maybe the next year, another year's worth of capital, which is invested in the 2nd year, is now paid for itself. So maybe it jumps to 2%. So you're into 15 years of a binary economy. Maybe people are earning maybe 8, 9, 10% of their income from capital. They still have to work. They still may be dependent on welfare. They still may need the help of their relatives and friends. But slowly but surely, in the same way that trees begin to grow and then begin to produce apples, it's a slow process where people are increasingly liberated from toil, and they have more resources to begin slowly but surely improving themselves. Someone who's now earning 12 or 14% of his or her income from capital might say, well, maybe it's worth going to school. Before I was hopeless.
Right.
Maybe now I can afford it. Maybe now I can have somebody, with this little bit of capital income, I can get someone to take care of my children, so I can take that course.
Right.
It's an opportunity to grow, and it's slow and gradual. People aren't suddenly made into capitalists where they just have to sit on their hands. That's not the way the system works. It's slow, gradual, and natural.
Well, thank you so much, Robert Ashford, Professor Ashford. This is Paula Gloria, and this has been an episode farther down the rabbit hole, and I hope to go into these topics much more deeply. And perhaps on our next show we can talk about super ESOPs in the same way that growth is slow and gradual and natural, but at the same time I think once we're informed we can have a deeper understanding of the potentials.
It would be a pleasure. Thank you so much for
Great.
your wonderful public service.
Oh,
You
thank
really
you.
are doing something that is dearly needed in our society.
Well, thank you. So what I'll do is I'll get this up on YouTube, and then I will glean some of the comments from people, and then next week at 3 o'clock, we can go into that more deeply.
Excellent.
Okay? Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
Okay, bye. So there you go. We were streaming on rabbitholecentral.tv, and that was Robert Ashford, who's a professor at Syracuse. He's got all kinds of wonderful credentials, you know, the Phi Beta Kappa Harvard and all that. But what most excites me about him is he wants to present as widely as possible knowledge that will, I think, although it's based in principles of nature, it's still radical according to the conditioning and the training that we've had and the education, which oftentimes training, even in a spiritual practice, a type of training becomes conditioning, and it takes away the spontaneity and the freshness, the openness, the naturalness of something like a higher style of consciousness or awareness. In that case, it's radical to say, leave all your conditioning aside. But at the same time, what he's proposing does take discipline. And I think John Cheshire was talking of the same thing when he spoke with Rosalie Grable, that on one hand, you need to find the scientists or the thinkers or the putterers, he would even say,